Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Camelot Unchained's lore series. I'm your host Swiper, and today I want to read part 1 of the Valkyrie story. So, if you're a huge Viking like myself, stay tuned because this is a pretty kick-ass story. So before we get started, I want to go over 2 things. First off, I'm reading this story directly from Camelot Unchained's website, so if you're interested in this story, go ahead and check out their lore section on their main webpage. Second, this story is actually a bit graphic, so discretion is definitely advised. So with all that being said, let's get started. Gather around, my children, and hear the saga of the Valkyries, the story of our race birth, said the aged Valkyrie as she fluttered her wings. After many long years of flying, they had begun to show signs of decay, but they were still strong and kicked up a swirl of snow in the courtyard. The group of youngsters quickly surrounded her. You have come of an age, and now old enough to know this dark tale. For though our story is horrible and gruesome, it must never be forgotten. Do not be embarrassed to shed tears. Tears are not a sign of weakness. Empathy is our greatest virtue, and we learn it from our origins. As you listen, recall our code and the oath you have all taken. Shaken by the elder Valkyrie's serious tone, the boys and girls sat in silence, their wild, haired heads bobbing attentively in time with her story. It is true that the piercing of the veil brought many terrors into this world. Yet we cannot ignore the awful truth. The world has twisted souls who do not need the influence of the veil storm to commit acts of the most terrible kind. In one of the mightiest fjords of our realm, there was a small island that held an even tinier village. Hardy folk lived, fished, and roamed the fjord, mostly young people and a few preserving elders. Unimaginable alterations swept through the land after the piercing. Yet, this tiny village somehow managed to weather the storms on this remote island. Life became very hard when the rocking waves and fierce winds destroyed their boats, cutting them off from the mainland. Hunger seeped through the village like a poison, as fishing was difficult and no one could get into the mainland without a boat. A young lady named Brynhild was one who never gave up hope. She roamed the small island, clutching the necklace her mother gave her for luck, looking for precious driftwood to help the boat makers with their task, though they have never asked her. Brynhild had always been a willful child. She was much more interested in the aggressive games that the village boys played than the dolls that her little sisters liked. From the time she was very small, the girl excelled at their gambles and their battle training, surpassing all the boys at her age. As they grew, the boys eventually surpassed her in size and strength, but she changed her fighting style accordingly. With her martial skill, she became a match for anyone. She became known as a protector early on, when one of the warlike games played by the older boys grew too rough, leaving the younger ones on the verge of tears. It was Brynhild who stepped in. Ducking and weaving, she brought down the older, stronger boys with a few well-placed blows. "Don't do it again," she told them firmly. "Fight someone who can fight back." And from then on, the smaller boy she just saved followed her around and tried to copy all of her movements and fighting styles. Her parents were very proud of Brynhild's accomplishments, for in her chest beat the heart of a true warrior. The girl promised her mother that she would keep the necklace safe forever, but that promise would prove as difficult to keep as catching the autumn wind. The wind carried a salty cold that made the island's inhabitants shiver. The few children who were doing their chores glanced up and hoped it wasn't another storm. Something about the cold wind made them want to go somewhere, want to go exploring, anywhere on the island that they hadn't seen before, as if it were to escape the rattling winds and its icy fingers. It was the wind of the coming fall, bringing a new or different scent of the sea. The wind whistled through the cracks of the walls and wicker baskets that they carried across town. The wind brought a dot on the horizon that grew and grew, grabbing the attention of the villagers with a glimpse of salvation. The cry rang around the village like the trolling of a bell. "A sail! A sail! A ship from the mainland!" The villagers rejoiced, dropping their desperate boat making and all their daily tasks. They rushed down to the shore, waving their arms excitedly. Rescued at last, men and women laughed and smiled and welcomed, overjoyed at their good fortune. But they couldn't have been more wrong. As the sail rode the ominous wind closer to the island, some of the older villagers grew concerned, for it had the look of a warship. But they had nothing worth taking in their village, and the weapons on the deck stayed in the scabbards. Fear faded as the men and scattered women of the crew smiled and waved to the villagers on shore as if they were long-lost relatives. Brynhild stood among the crowd near the shore. She smiled and nodded with the other girls as they laughed in relief and commented on which warrior was the most comely. Something in her heart felt sick with fear. Though Brynhild couldn't say why, she grabbed her amulet and tucked it under her shirt. One of the boys, a younger brother to one of that Brynhild had saved, ran down to greet the first man that splashed ashore. Beaming up at the tall, roughly dressed warrior, the boy grinned happily, even though the lad barely reached the warrior's knee. He burst out, "Let me carry some of your gear ashore, sir." The stranger grinned in return, tapping the boy's head. Without changing his expression, the man drew his sword and swung it in a tight arc, cleanly separating the boy's head from his shoulders. It happened in an instant. The boy's helpful smile spun as his head bounced away, and his lifeless body collapsed into the sand, gushing blood. There was a moment of stunned silence among the onlookers. Then, as the rest of the warriors howled and leaped ashore, they broke and ran screaming. None of them could run very far. The island was small and had nowhere to hide. They were gathered together like stray cattle, with no chance to organize a defense against the overwhelming power of these raiders. The days of brutality had only just begun, dark days that most only speak of in the faintest of whispers. The invaders ran amok, murdering villagers in ways that should have sickened even the most hardened warrior. And yet, they were just getting started. Some of the villagers were bound and used for target practice. Several young men were castrated and used by invaders in the most horrific ways. This was not done to fulfill bodily desire. The strangers wished for power and pain, causing their victims to suffer in the cruelest way they could conceive. The village elders were treated as packed animals. The invaders competed with each other to devise ever crueler ways to humiliate and demoralize them. Contests were held to see who could come up with the most novel way to break an old man through sheer exertion. When the last of the group died, the tormentors turned their attention to the dozens of imprisoned villagers. Commencing a drunken fest, they separated the survivors into two groups. One group was immediately forced to serve their new masters. They were made to put posture like dogs and beg for what little food they were given. The first evening was filled with laughter, folk weeping, in between playing the mad game. The more awful their abuse, the more the invaders laughed and celebrated their own imagined bravery and strength. They forced the villagers to thank them for the honor bestowed on them, lucky survivors. The warriors drank themselves into stupor at their vile feast, yet never relaxed their grip on the weapons. There was no question of resistance. The surviving villagers were weak and shivering with humiliation and fear. The new dawn did not deliver a true daylight to the village. The sun rose faint and red, sickly and ominous. The second group of captives had been dressed in their finest garments and told to wait until the kindly new masters summoned them to the night's feast. The minutes turned into hours, and their apprehension mounted as they recalled the sounds of the night before. The terrified screams and desperate sobs of their friends mingled with the horrible laughter of those warriors. They prayed to the sky, to the old gods, to any powers that would save them and their lost loved ones. But when the summons to the feast finally came, there was still no response from the heavens. Shuddering, the villagers were dragged to the central square. Each captive in turn was made to stand on the table. They were then measured and assessed in every degrading way possible. Each warrior, according to rank, was allowed to choose one villager. The rest were told to stand ready in case any of the chosen didn't want to see the new morning. A priest was called forth, a grinning and dancing fat man who draped white cloth over his armor. In a mockery of a ceremony, each of the captives was wed to the warrior who had chosen him or her. Then, their hands bound, the newlyweds were dragged into a private room for their wedding night. The horrors that went on there were greater than anything that had come before. The subhuman torturers laughed and laughed long into the night, stopping only when the villagers were fortunate enough to stop screaming forever. As time passed and the days blurred together, the terrors eventually became predictable. Some sufferers grew numb and walked aimlessly around, mere shells of human beings. This emotionless state irritated the invaders, for they hungered for the struggle, for blood and terror. So the warriors began to devise new and unthinkable ways to torture their captives, trying to make them respond. Some of the aimless ones were beaten with spears, while survivors were forced to beg for more abuse each night. Through everything, Brynhild tried to retain her sanity. When she hadn't seen her parents for days, she knew they were gone. She was luckier, passed over for some of the worst horrors, and only kept in a pen like an animal. Along with a boy she had once defended, he survived the castration and the ensuing abuse. He endured quietly, teeth clenched, while the others wept. And that concludes part 1 of the Valkyrie story. So, without knowing what happens in part 2, what do you guys think of the story so far? Compared to the Drevgar story, this one was a bit more intense for me, and honestly, I had to read part 2 right away because this part 1 was pretty depressing. So if you guys want me to do part 2 in a similar fashion, hit me up in the comments below. I actually really like doing these videos. I like learning about the lore because, like I said before in some of my other videos, I never really followed the lore and the MMOs that I played. I kind of just played them and just leveled and didn't really think much of it. But like I said before again, a game seems to just get better or be better when you understand everything around you, when you understand your classes or your races and things like that. So that's why I enjoy doing these and I want to continue doing this. But anyway, if you guys like this video or any of my other videos, please hit the thumbs up. And if you want weekly news updates and or more videos like this, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.